Can you imagine the precise instant when the idea of wealth stops being something outside of you and begins to feel like it already lives within your chest, like a quiet certainty that does not need to be proven to anyone, not even yourself? This is where it begins, in the silent space between one thought and the next, where you no longer see wealth as numbers in the bank, but as a natural state of being that rises from your sense of self. This is the quiet shift where your inner dialogue softens, and the version of you that once strained and reached begins to dissolve like mist in warm light. This is how the old identity loosens, not through force, but through a gentle realization that the struggle was never required. This is the whisper that says, "I already am," before anything external changes, before any physical evidence arrives. This is where truth steps forward, reminding you that identity creates reality, not the other way around. This is where illusion fades, as you begin to see that your life has always been reflecting who you believed yourself to be. This is the moment you notice your breath change, slow, deepen, as though your body is remembering something ancient about belonging to abundance. This is where the body reacts, not with excitement or adrenaline, but with a grounded presence that feels like home. This is how the world begins to mirror the new inner tone, small things shifting, people responding differently, opportunities that once slipped by now pausing as if recognizing you. This is where doubt tries to speak, reminding you of the old story, but its voice is quieter now, lacking weight. This is where confidence breathes, not loud but steady, like a river that knows exactly where it is going. This is how wealth becomes a feeling, warm, expansive, patient, before it becomes form. This is the turning point, where you stop asking how and begin knowing that it is already unfolding in ways beyond your awareness. This is where the past no longer fits, not because you are running from it, but because you have simply outgrown its meaning. This is where the mind begins to unclench, releasing the need to chase, impress, or prove. This is where ease becomes familiar, like slipping into clothes that feel made for you. This is where desire softens into certainty. The need becomes the reality. The wish becomes the state. This is where you realize wealth was never external, never something to earn, chase, or deserve. It was always identity. This is the quiet arrival of a new self. The self that knows wealth not as something accumulated, but as something expressed, lived, and embodied from within. Picture for a moment the subtle realization that the person you used to be is no longer the one steering your life, even though nothing dramatic has occurred on the outside. This is where the shift becomes undeniable, not in loud revelation but in quiet contradictions that begin to appear in your reactions to everyday situations. This is where you do not panic where you once would have, where you do not shrink where you once felt small, and you begin to notice it almost by accident. This is how it unfolds, when a new identity has taken root beneath conscious awareness and begins gently rewriting your behavior. This is the moment where you recognize that wealth, as a state, expresses itself in how you breathe, wait, listen, and respond to life. This is where you find yourself no longer calculating cost as a survival reflex, but evaluating experiences through a lens of natural sufficiency. This is where truth breaks through in the smallest gestures, the way you hold your shoulders, the way your voice steadies, the way you pause before speaking. This is where the previous version of you tries to return, out of habit, not out of belonging. This is the turning point where you realize that the old self is no longer believable, even to you. This is where illusion falls away, revealing that your limitations were never absolute. They were learned identities, wearing the mask of truth. This is where the emotional texture of your life begins to shift from anxious striving into grounded anticipation. This is where certainty enters the room like a quiet guest and sits beside you without needing introduction. This is where you begin to feel that life is not happening to you, but responding to you. This is where alignment is not something you chase, but something you hold, like a tone in the body, a resonance that hums beneath your thoughts. This is why wealth as identity has nothing to do with a bank balance and everything to do with the way your presence now communicates self-trust. This is where new choices become natural, not forced, because your inner reference point has changed. This is where scarcity begins to feel foreign, Like an old language you no longer speak. This is the quiet revelation that you no longer ask, "Can I?" but instead assume, "I will." This is the moment where you no longer identify as someone trying to become wealthy. You simply feel like someone who is. This is how the old self crumbles. Not through effort, but through the effortless emergence of the one you were always meant to step into. Now consider this. The inner dialogue you once spoke without awareness begins to sound unfamiliar, as though a new narrator is speaking from within. Here is the shift where the mind stops begging life for permission and begins speaking from a place of quiet ownership. In this subtle moment, you realize that wealth is not declared through loud affirmations, but through the tone of certainty beneath your thoughts. Then comes the adjustment where you stop asking questions like, "How will it happen?" and begin leaning into the assumption that it already is. What emerges now is not fantasy, but identity. Because the mind does not need proof to believe what it already considers natural. Gradually, your internal language shifts from scarcity's sharp edges into the smooth confidence of sufficiency. Quietly, the need to convince yourself dissolves, because the new state feels too real to require reinforcement. Softly, the anxious narratives of the past lose their grip, their emotional charge fading like echoes from a room you no longer live in. Yet importantly, this shift is not theatrical. It is intimate, private, almost sacred. In the background, your self-concept is rewriting the rules of how your reality interacts with you. Unseen by others, your inner voice becomes aligned with someone who expects abundance rather than hopes for it. Like a tide changing, your assumptions begin to move silently in favor of outcomes that once felt out of reach. As your presence settles, your mind starts forming sentences that assume access, acceptance, and worthiness. Without effort, you begin to respond to life in ways that communicate, "I am already provided for." Before you notice it fully, the world begins to treat you differently. Not because it changed, but because your language told it who you now are. In the gentle silence between thoughts, you realize you no longer negotiate your value. With growing clarity, you understand that the wealthy identity is expressed most powerfully through the calmness of your inner narrative. As your self-concept matures, your decisions gain weight, precision, and direction. In your emotional undercurrent, certainty replaces longing, presence replaces reaching, and being replaces becoming. This deepens into a truth that wealth has always been a voice you speak from, not an outcome you chase toward. Suppose you discover that the real difference between your former self and your emerging wealthy identity is not in thought alone, but in the emotional rhythm that moves through your body each day. Here's where the shift becomes deeply physical, as though your nervous system itself begins learning a new tempo of existence. Then comes the realization that lack was never about money, but about the pacing of your breath, your reactions, your waiting. And now you notice how the wealthy identity carries a softness, a steadiness, an unhurried cadence that says, "There is always enough." This is where the old rhythm attempts to return, with its urgency and its panic and its need to control everything at once. But this is where you pause, breathe, and choose to remain in the frequency of sufficiency instead. Now the body begins to relax into the truth that abundance is not an event, but a state of being. Here the sense of ease spreads slowly, like warm light filling a once dim corridor. Then your thoughts begin to follow the body's lead, forming patterns that assume gentleness, assurance, and inevitability. This is where emotional wealth becomes evident, in the way you handle delays, conversations, uncertainties, and open spaces in your life. Then you realize that the wealthy identity does not rush toward outcomes. It allows outcomes to unfold from alignment. Here the heart begins to settle, no longer oscillating between hope and fear, but resting in the middle where certainty lives. Now you understand that wealth is not loud excitement, but quiet belonging. Then the rhythm of ease becomes your natural state, no longer something you must practice or remember. Here the world responds differently, because energy communicates before words ever do. Then you no longer interpret waiting as lack, but as the unfolding of timing already aligned with you. Here trust becomes the foundation beneath every choice you make. Then your inner pace slows to match the frequency of someone who knows they cannot lose what is theirs. Here you embody a truth that wealth is not a chase, but an atmosphere. Then the rhythm of your entire life begins to harmonize with sufficiency, like music resolving into its true key. Think of the moment when you realize that wealth expresses itself first, not in possessions, but in the way you move through the world with unforced calm. In that quiet shift, your breath becomes slower, deeper, no longer rushing as though life must be chased to be caught. At the edges of awareness, you begin to notice how the wealthy identity does not hurry, because it trusts timing as an ally rather than an obstacle. Beneath the surface, your nervous system unwinds from the tight knot of survival into the spacious ease of sufficiency. In the subtle language of posture and pacing, you begin to walk through life as someone who is already resourced. Along the inner corridors of thought, urgency fades, replaced by the elegant patience of someone who knows everything arrives when it should. At the center of your presence, silence becomes powerful rather than uncomfortable. From the depth of your being, you realize you no longer feel compelled to explain yourself or justify your choices. In the tone of your voice, there is steadiness, not force, not proving, just quiet certainty. Through your decisions, you now choose rather than chase, select rather than scramble. Across conversations, your words become fewer but carry more weight because they come from identity rather than insecurity. Within your inner atmosphere, your emotional state no longer spikes in reaction to circumstance. It remains consistent like a grounded shoreline meeting the tide. Over time, situations that once triggered panic now meet a presence that does not waver. In the mirror of your own awareness, you see that wealth was always a frequency of being, not an external acquisition. Across the rhythm of your days, spacious pauses replace frantic motion. In your relationship to time, patience becomes a form of power rather than a forced discipline. Through your interactions, ease becomes the signal of your new state, not something you attempt to display, but something you naturally embody. At the core of your self-concept, the wealthy identity is no longer an aspiration, it is the baseline. Across your emotional landscape, you live in the truth that having is a state, not a circumstance. And in the silence within you, you finally understand that wealth has always been the breath you allow, not the breath you chase. Ask yourself, what happens when the part of you that once needed to prove your worth finally begins to loosen its grip and fade? Here is where the identity of striving begins to crumble, not through force, but through realization. This is where you understand that the need to be seen, validated, or approved was always rooted in the belief that you were lacking something. This is where the wealthy identity reveals itself as a state that does not seek confirmation because it already knows. This is the moment where your past attempts to justify your value to others begin to feel distant, almost like overhearing an old version of yourself speaking in another room. This is where the voice that once chased approval becomes quiet, no longer required as evidence of ownership grows from within. This is where your self-worth is no longer conditional, no longer dependent on reaction, attention, or applause. This is where the center of your identity shifts inward, where your value is felt rather than argued. This is where the wealthy identity stops needing the world to mirror it back in every moment. This is where your presence becomes enough, whole, and sovereign. This is the turning point where your identity stops being something you defend and becomes something you simply are. This is where the body relaxes, because it is no longer preparing to prove itself. This is where your decisions come from internal clarity rather than external permission. This is where silence becomes comfort rather than emptiness. This is where the old survival pattern of "I need to show I am enough" dissolves into the quiet knowing of "I already am." This is where relationships shift, because you no longer enter them seeking recognition. You bring presence, not need. This is where opportunities align more naturally, because your energy no longer signals desperation or dependency. This is where wealth becomes a grounded expression rather than a performance. This is where you realize that having nothing to prove is one of the purest signs of abundance. And this is where you begin to live, not as a person reaching for wealth, but as someone who has already become the one who it naturally belongs to. Consider the possibility that confidence does not arrive with achievement, but precedes it, shaping the world to match the identity you hold within. In this subtle shift, confidence stops being something you try to project, and instead becomes something that radiates without intention. In the quietest moments, you begin to notice that your presence feels grounded, as though you are seated deeply in yourself. In the way you speak, there is no rush, no push, no grasping, only the gentle authority of someone who knows they belong. In the way you hold your body, there is no tension of trying to impress, only the natural elegance of self-acceptance. In the thoughts that cross your mind, there is no pleading tone, only the steady assumption that life is unfolding in your favor. In your emotional climate, calm becomes the default, rather than occasional relief. In the choices you make, you move with the clarity of someone who trusts their internal compass. In your daily life, you stop explaining yourself, because your identity no longer requires an audience. In the silence inside you, there's a soft warmth that feels like home. In interactions, people feel your presence rather than your performance. In opportunities, doors begin to open, not because you force them, but because your energy signals readiness. In moments of uncertainty, you no longer collapse into doubt, you lean into knowing. In outcomes, you expect alignment rather than fear disappointment. In reflections, you see a person who does not chase wealth, but embodies it. In the rhythm of your days, patience carries you rather than pressure driving you. In the atmosphere of your mind, assumptions quietly shift from "I hope" to "of course." In the undercurrent of your being, wealth is not something you reach for, it is something you express. And in this soft confidence, the world responds to who you have become, long before anyone can fully understand how you changed. Envision a world where you suddenly find yourself comfortable in spaces that once felt too large for the person you used to believe you were. Here comes the subtle realization that the room has not changed. You have. And now your posture reflects belonging rather than hesitation, as though your presence is a natural part of the atmosphere. What unfolds next is the quiet recognition that the wealthy identity is not about display, but about ease. Along this path, you notice that you no longer search the faces of others for permission to exist. In this quiet shift, your breath remains steady even in environments that once triggered insecurity. At the edge of awareness, you recognize that your value does not increase or decrease depending on the company you keep. From this vantage, you observe how others respond to you differently, as though they sense a new gravity in your presence. Within the atmosphere of your presence, there is no reaching, only grounded being. Across the landscape of your decisions, every choice now comes from alignment rather than fear. Beyond the surface of old habits, you find that your attention has shifted from trying to fit in to simply expressing what is true. At the center of your being, you understand that belonging is not granted by others, it is assumed by the self. In the unfolding of your days, confidence becomes something lived rather than performed. Underneath the quiet of your breath, you carry the certainty that there is nothing to prove. Far beneath the noise of expectation, your identity is no longer shaped by comparison. Within this new belonging, rooms that once felt overwhelming now feel like familiar territory. Just beyond the threshold of your old identity, you recognize that wealth is not about owning a room, but about not shrinking within it. In the stillness between choices, your presence speaks on your behalf without a single word. Across the doorway of new experience, you realize the world adjusts to the tone you hold. Beneath the tone of your voice, there is a depth that signals self-trust. And in the way the room responds, you see the reflection of the identity you have now become. Effortless, grounded, and quietly undeniable. Picture for a moment the subtle transformation that occurs when your body itself begins to carry the story of wealth before your mind even articulates it. This is where posture becomes language, and every shift in your spine or shoulders communicates authority and ease. This is where the way you stand no longer conveys tension, fear, or doubt, but signals presence and belonging without words. This is how the wealthy identity becomes visible before any achievement or external marker appears. This is where the chest opens, the head lifts, and the movements flow with the rhythm of confidence rather than effort. This is the moment when others respond to you unconsciously, because energy precedes explanation. This is how subtle gestures, the set of your jaw, the pace of your walk, and the steadiness of your hands begin to signal an unspoken certainty. This is where inner alignment manifests outwardly, and the body mirrors what the mind quietly accepts as true. This is how tension from the old self begins to dissolve, replaced by a natural grace that feels like ease itself. This is where your presence commands space, not through force but through the silent assertion of identity. This is how meetings, conversations, and interactions start to favor you without you trying to influence the outcome. This is where physical embodiment becomes the first proof of inner assumption, visible to anyone with eyes to see. This is the turning point where your body no longer betrays your mind but becomes an extension of your inner certainty. This is how habit reshapes the flesh, training every micro-movement to reflect sufficiency and calm. This is where self-respect emerges naturally, not as a concept, but as an energetic presence. This is the subtle mastery of influence, when posture communicates before words can be heard. This is where wealth identity is encoded in muscle memory, in the way you breathe, in the way you sit, in the way you move through thresholds. This is the quiet revelation that the body does not lie. It mirrors your inner belief system. This is where confidence ceases to be performance and becomes effortless reality. And this is how the world begins to recognize you not by what you say or have, but by the person your body now inhabits with natural authority. Now consider this. The moment you fully inhabit the identity of wealth, the world begins to shift around you almost imperceptibly, as if recognizing a frequency it once overlooked. This is where doors start to open that had previously been closed, not through force or effort, but simply because your presence signals readiness. This is how meetings, opportunities, and conversations begin to favor you before you consciously ask for them. This is where intuition sharpens, guiding you toward choices that feel aligned rather than forced. This is where small coincidences begin to accumulate, forming a pattern that your rational mind struggles to explain. This is where people treat you differently, responding to the unseen authority of someone who assumes success rather than chasing it. This is how the universe mirrors your inner state before reality fully catches up. This is the turning point where patience replaces anxiety and observation replaces panic. This is where timing seems magically precise, as though life itself conspires to honor the identity you hold. This is where you realize that abundance responds to your assumed state rather than your bank balance. This is how wealth becomes relational, as your interactions reflect the confidence and sufficiency you embody. This is where recognition, respect, and opportunity arrive naturally, drawn to the energy you consistently radiate. This is how alignment precedes manifestation, making your path feel effortless even when effortful action is required. This is where the inner transformation silently orchestrates outer events, like a conductor unseen behind the music. This is where the world no longer tests your belief, but accommodates it. This is the quiet proof that identity drives experience far more than circumstances ever could. This is where trust deepens, because the evidence appears before your mind fully understands it. This is where you start living in a reality that feels custom-built for the person you have assumed yourself to be. This is how life itself becomes a reflection of the state you inhabit. And this is the moment you finally see that wealth as a way of being has been responding to your inner assumption all along, silently shaping the world to fit the person you have become. Envision a moment when you realize that wealth is not measured by possessions or numbers, but by the emotional frequency that hums beneath your every thought and action. This is where the feeling of abundance becomes the constant backdrop, like a melody that never leaves, grounding every choice and interaction. This is how you notice the absence of anxiety in moments that once triggered fear, replaced now by a calm certainty that life is unfolding as it should. This is where gratitude deepens, not as an occasional act, but as the natural response of a person who knows sufficiency is their birthright. This is where joy no longer depends on external events, because the wealth identity generates its own internal resonance. This is the subtle energy that others unconsciously read, compelling respect, trust, and connection before words are exchanged. This is where disappointment loses its power, because your internal state is not dependent on outcome, but on presence. This is the turning point where contentment becomes not a passive state, but an active, powerful magnet for opportunity. This is where the body begins to relax fully, resonating with ease instead of tension, aligning physicality with the mind's certainty. This is where decisions emerge from clarity rather than fear, reflecting a core that is unshakable. This is where financial choices no longer carry the weight of desperation, but the lightness of assurance. This is how emotional consistency becomes the currency of your identity, far more valuable than numbers in the bank. This is where your energy, calm and expansive, begins to create space for growth, abundance, and influence. This is the moment when relationships, circumstances, and even luck seem to shift naturally to accommodate the vibration you maintain. This is where wealth begins to feel inevitable, not because of logic, but because your inner frequency commands it. This is where your internal climate shapes external events, silently orchestrating alignment in ways you are only beginning to notice. This is the quiet mastery of self, where emotion becomes evidence of your assumed state. This is where the nervous system embodies wealth before it appears materially. This is where satisfaction and expectation merge seamlessly, creating a sense of fullness that cannot be shaken. And this is where you truly understand that wealth is never in numbers. It is in the emotional signature you carry, and that signature now defines the life you live. Picture for a moment the unshakable calm that comes when you no longer worry about outcomes because you deeply know you are already provided for. This is where panic and fear lose their grip, replaced by a steady current of trust that flows beneath every decision. This is how patience becomes effortless, because timing is no longer something you chase, but something you inhabit. This is where you notice how small anxieties fade instantly, leaving room for clarity and focus. This is how the wealthy identity manifests in subtle gestures. Hands relaxed, shoulders steady, gaze soft yet assured. This is where you act from certainty, not desperation, and every choice carries the weightless authority of someone aligned with abundance. This is the quiet revelation that needing is replaced by knowing and wanting is replaced by assuming. This is where your mind stops calculating outcomes and begins envisioning experiences, allowing life to orchestrate itself around your state of being. This is where your inner compass becomes flawless, guiding decisions with ease because doubt no longer interferes. This is the moment when trust saturates every interaction, every financial decision, every opportunity that arises. This is how inner security radiates outward, shaping circumstances without conscious effort. This is where you recognize that being provided for is not about receiving, but about assuming a state that attracts provision naturally. This is the turning point where scarcity no longer tempts you, because your awareness has shifted to sufficiency. This is where every breath reinforces your identity as someone who belongs to abundance. This is the subtle art of living from a state, rather than responding to conditions. This is where internal alignment begins to orchestrate external evidence effortlessly. This is the place where wealth is not measured in assets, but in the unshakable certainty you carry. This is where every step, decision, and pause confirms that the universe operates in accordance with your assumed state. This is how life becomes a reflection of your internal knowing, before a single outward action is required. And this is where you realize that the calm certainty of being provided for is the foundation upon which all material and non-material wealth is built. Consider the possibility that money is never the destination, but a mirror reflecting the identity you carry within, revealing the depth of your inner assumption. This is where the obsession with accumulation fades, replaced by the quiet understanding that wealth is expressed through who you are, rather than what you hold. This is how you begin to see every transaction, opportunity, and encounter as a reflection of your state rather than a measurement of success. This is where need and lack lose their hold, because you realize the outer forms always echo the inner belief. This is where spending and receiving become gestures of natural flow rather than acts of desperation. This is where your focus shifts from numbers in the bank to the frequency of sufficiency that underlies every choice. This is how the nervous system begins to embody the truth that abundance exists first in consciousness. This is the turning point where material wealth becomes evidence, not the cause, of your assumed identity. This is where clarity replaces worry, because you know the reflection will always match your inner state. This is where your financial decisions begin to align with presence, calm, and certainty, rather than fear or urgency. This is how wealth begins to appear effortlessly, because the inner narrative no longer contradicts the outer reality. This is where gratitude for what already exists amplifies the reflection of abundance in your life. This is where you stop chasing and start recognizing, noticing how the world shifts naturally in response to your state. This is the subtle mastery of assuming identity, where external evidence is drawn like a magnet to your internal alignment. This is where patience and timing are trusted, not feared, because provision has become inevitable. This is where the focus on numbers dissolves, replaced by attention to feeling, perception, and being. This is how every moment of abundance, no matter how small, reinforces your internal conviction. This is the quiet realization that true wealth cannot be counted, only reflected. This is where the mirror of life confirms the power of assumed identity, repeatedly and effortlessly. And this is where you fully grasp that money is never the goal. It is simply a reflection of the person you have become from within. Ask yourself what it feels like when the world itself starts to bend subtly to match the state you have assumed before any deliberate action is taken. This is where doors that once seemed locked begin to open as if welcoming a presence they recognize. This is how synchronicities accumulate, small coincidences stacking into patterns too precise to ignore. This is where opportunities appear effortlessly, almost as if life itself conspires to support the identity you now inhabit. This is the point where timing stops being a problem and begins to feel like an ally, orchestrating events around your state of being. This is where interactions shift. People respond differently, not to persuasion or effort, but to the unspoken authority you carry. This is how projects, ideas, and possibilities align with your presence before you even act. This is where your internal certainty begins to manifest in outer circumstances, confirming what you have assumed all along. This is where you notice that life no longer tests your belief. It mirrors it. This is the turning point where patience becomes natural, not forced, because you understand the universe moves in concert with your assumed self. This is how the environment begins to resonate with your energy, silently recognizing your worth. This is where financial, relational, and personal opportunities unfold in unexpected but harmonious ways. This is the quiet power of identity, demonstrating that the inner state always precedes the outer reality. This is how the nervous system senses alignment, guiding choices before conscious reasoning intervenes. This is where you start to act from possibility rather than scarcity, and every step feels guided. This is where circumstances that once intimidated now feel like extensions of your own certainty. This is how life arranges itself around the identity you have assumed, not around desire or need. This is where patience, observation, and quiet expectation become your most powerful tools. This is the subtle mastery of living in a reality that has already rearranged itself in response to your state. And this is where you begin to realize that the world will always reflect the identity you carry, whether you are aware of it or not. Envision a world where doors seem to open before you even knock, as if the opportunities themselves sense the identity you now carry. This is where you notice that your presence alone begins to attract the right people, situations, and resources without effort. This is the subtle language of alignment, where timing, chance, and intention converge seamlessly around the state you embody. This is where your decisions become intuitive, guided by an internal compass that has replaced hesitation with clarity. This is the turning point where once elusive possibilities now appear naturally, reflecting the certainty you hold within. This is how small openings grow into pathways, and minor interactions transform into pivotal encounters. This is where confidence no longer demands validation, because the universe itself begins to acknowledge your assumed state. This is where the rhythm of your life shifts, and events that once felt random now follow a pattern of purposeful alignment. This is how recognition manifests, not through ego or performance, but through quiet acknowledgement of your inner authority. This is the moment when you realize that external circumstances respond to your internal calibration before you even act. This is where patience and readiness become more valuable than frantic effort or pushing. This is the subtle art of presence, where being fully yourself becomes magnetically productive. This is where financial, creative, and relational openings arrive with a sense of inevitability. This is how the nervous system begins to trust, sensing the alignment before logic can rationalize it. This is where scarcity, fear, and doubt dissolve in the presence of inner certainty. This is how opportunity becomes a reflection of your assumed identity rather than something you chase. This is where momentum grows naturally, powered by the state you inhabit rather than action alone. This is the quiet but undeniable confirmation that wealth is not numbers in the bank. It is identity recognized by life itself. This is where every interaction, choice, and alignment strengthens the person you have become. And this is where you fully grasp that the universe responds first to the self you assume, and only secondarily to the things you pursue. Think of the moment when the frantic pursuit of wealth dissolves, replaced by the effortless clarity of choice rather than desperation. This is where you notice that life no longer demands pushing, scrambling, or pleading. Instead, it presents paths aligned with your assumed identity. This is where the nervous system relaxes fully, knowing that the flow of opportunity meets the person who already believes in their abundance. This is where decisions are made from a place of calm authority, not fear or urgency. This is the subtle revelation that selection carries more power than pursuit, and alignment outweighs effort. This is where patience becomes a natural tool, because timing now works with you rather than against you. This is how the wealthy identity shifts the focus from scarcity-driven chasing to intentional reception. This is the turning point where you trust that the right opportunities will appear exactly when needed. This is where discernment replaces anxiety and clarity replaces confusion in every choice you make. This is how your inner energy begins to magnetize outcomes without conscious effort. This is where wanting softens into assuming, and the nervous system stabilizes in ease. This is where every step taken feels guided rather than forced, and every action resonates with natural authority. This is where doors that once required negotiation now swing open effortlessly. This is where the world mirrors your confidence in being already provided for. This is where alignment becomes the silent force behind every material and relational gain. This is where external wealth becomes a reflection of internal mastery. This is how the state of being wealthy transforms from aspiration into natural lifestyle. This is where the pace of life itself feels different, measured by presence rather than reaction. This is where you begin to understand that the art of living is not in chasing, but in choosing with unwavering certainty. And this is the quiet mastery of abundance. The person who assumes wealth does not pursue it. They simply step into it, and the world follows. Envision a world where abundance is no longer something you reach for, but the very atmosphere you inhabit, surrounding you effortlessly like air itself. This is where every moment, every environment, every interaction begins to feel aligned with the state you have assumed. This is how your perception shifts, noticing opportunities, resources, and pathways that were invisible when you identified with lack. This is the turning point where scarcity becomes foreign and ease becomes the natural rhythm of your life. This is where your attention no longer dwells on what is missing, but on what is already flowing through your reality. This is how your internal state sets the stage for external experiences, like a conductor silently orchestrating a symphony. This is where the nervous system recognizes comfort in abundance, and tension naturally dissolves. This is where confidence grows organically, expressed in posture, speech, and presence without effort. This is how relationships, collaborations, and opportunities respond to the energy you carry rather than your demands. This is where the world begins to feel like a playground of provision, inviting participation rather than requiring struggle. This is where your inner certainty becomes the gravitational pull that draws experiences toward you. This is how even waiting transforms, no longer tense or anxious, but relaxed and assured. This is the moment when wealth stops being external and begins to feel like a default setting in your life. This is where subtle signs of prosperity appear everywhere, confirming your alignment without forcing it. This is how financial flow, creative expression, and personal satisfaction coexist seamlessly, each reinforcing the other. This is where patience is no longer discipline, but a natural extension of trust in your state. This is where presence itself communicates your assumed identity to the universe. This is where opportunities no longer feel like luck, but like responses to your consistent vibration. This is how wealth becomes as ordinary as breathing, yet as profound as a sun rising unseen behind clouds. And this is where you finally embody the truth that abundance is not a destination. It is the environment you carry, and everything else unfolds accordingly. Picture for a moment the subtle shift when people begin to sense your presence as someone who embodies certainty, influence, and abundance before you even speak. This is where authority is communicated without assertion, and respect is granted without demand. This is how your posture, tone, and energy combine to create a magnetic field that draws attention naturally. This is where the wealthy identity no longer hides. It radiates in quiet confidence, in calm gestures, in steady gaze. This is the turning point where others instinctively defer, follow guidance, or seek your insight, not because of position, but because of presence. This is how interactions begin to flow differently, opening doors, creating opportunities, and fostering collaboration effortlessly. This is where your internal state shapes external perception, silently signaling readiness and provision. This is where influence becomes organic, born from alignment rather than manipulation. This is how your choices now carry weight beyond personal gain, inspiring trust and admiration. This is the subtle realization that identity communicates faster and more powerfully than words ever could. This is where the world mirrors your inner mastery, acknowledging what you already know to be true. This is how opportunities, partnerships, and wealth respond to the frequency you maintain consistently. This is where patience, clarity, and calm assert more authority than effort or striving ever could. This is where others unconsciously measure themselves against the standard you now live as. This is how leadership emerges naturally when the inner state precedes outer form. This is the moment where your assumed identity begins to influence environments, situations, and even cultural rhythms around you. This is how subtlety and presence replace urgency and proving. This is where the quiet power of being becomes the catalyst for recognition and success. This is how the wealthy identity manifests socially, professionally, and personally without conscious effort. And this is where you fully understand that once you become the person others look toward, abundance, respect, and opportunity follow not by chance, but by the natural order of assumed identity. Now consider this. The moment your assumed identity no longer requires reinforcement because it has become the default state of your being. This is where consistency replaces effort and alignment flows naturally without conscious maintenance. This is how your nervous system internalizes abundance, making confidence, ease, and provision habitual rather than occasional. This is where the old cycles of doubt, chasing, and scarcity attempt to return but find no foothold. This is the turning point where wealth ceases to feel like something you pursue and instead feels like the natural expression of who you are. This is where decision-making becomes effortless, guided by internal clarity rather than external pressure. This is how patience, trust, and certainty sustain themselves across circumstances and time. This is where your emotional and physical states harmonize, creating a foundation that supports continual flow. This is where opportunities, recognition, and resources continue to arrive without force or struggle. This is how the internal environment shapes external reality seamlessly, moment after moment. This is where identity no longer wavers because it has been fully internalized. This is where the body, mind, and spirit resonate in alignment, making wealth feel inevitable. This is how your presence consistently communicates sufficiency, influence, and readiness. This is where provision feels automatic, not earned, not questioned, simply experienced. This is where the state of abundance sustains itself, even in the absence of immediate evidence. This is the subtle mastery of energy, where alignment fuels opportunity, and opportunity reinforces alignment. This is where ease, calm, and confidence become habitual, the unspoken norm of your being. This is where wealth is no longer a goal, but the natural atmosphere of your existence. This is where identity carries momentum, creating self-perpetuating cycles of opportunity and fulfillment. And this is how the state of assumed wealth sustains itself effortlessly, forming the foundation for a life of continuous natural abundance. Ask yourself what it feels like when every part of your being, mind, body, and spirit, fully aligns with the identity of wealth. No longer separate, no longer conditional. This is where the nervous system, emotional state, and thought patterns resonate as one coherent frequency of abundance. This is how presence itself becomes currency, radiating confidence, sufficiency, and influence without effort or intention. This is where external reality ceases to dictate your sense of worth, because your identity has internalized provision as a baseline. This is the turning point where patience, clarity, and certainty are constants, not exceptions, in every interaction and choice. This is how financial, relational, and creative abundance flow continuously, reflecting a state rather than chasing outcomes. This is where the body carries ease, posture communicates authority, and gestures express quiet confidence naturally. This is where decisions emerge effortlessly, guided by internal knowing rather than external pressure. This is the subtle mastery of energy, where your assumed state shapes circumstance before conscious action. This is where opportunities, recognition, and alignment arrive organically, as if the world itself acknowledges your identity. This is where scarcity and doubt have no foothold, replaced entirely by trust, flow, and certainty. This is how life itself becomes a mirror of the self you have assumed, with every moment reinforcing your state. This is where the internal landscape, your thoughts, emotions, and sensations, dictates the external landscape with seamless precision. This is how the art of living abundantly becomes instinctive, automatic, and deeply satisfying. This is where the rhythm of life feels effortless, measured by alignment rather than struggle. This is where wealth is fully embodied, not a pursuit, not a measurement, but a living experience. This is where confidence, presence, and calm act as the foundation for all outcomes. This is where being wealthy is not about accumulation, but about the full expression of identity. This is the quiet, undeniable truth that abundance is a state already within, and all life responds accordingly. And this is the ultimate mastery: to live as someone who does not chase wealth, but simply as wealth in every breath, gesture, and moment of being.